So in this next session on science and Christian faith, I want to begin by reminding us of the ancient origins of scientific approaches, whether we go back to the ancient Greeks or whether we go back to Solomon and Proverbs in the Bible, encouraging us to have wisdom as we look at the natural world around us, or whether we look at medieval development of science as we looked at. It's worth remembering that in ancient Greece, you had scientific thinking by those like Archimedes, who at one stage said, give me a place to stand. I could move the earth using levers, as he used leverage to move ships, used leverage to perform a great deal of engineering. And as a young man, Archimedes studied at the great library of Alexandria in Egypt. Archimedes was asked at one stage about how he could prove that a famous gold-covered crown was pure gold rather than silver covered by gold. And as he jumped in the bath, he realised that that would give him the volume of the object, and then he could look at the weight of the object, and he left out Eureka, meaning I've got it, I've worked it out. He's also famous for working out that the volume of a sphere is exactly 2/3 of the cylinder it contains. So I'm wanting to emphasize that science is not just a recent development, it's also part of the ancient world, including water mills. Also, we have latrines and concern about cleanliness, and these are ancient world latrines in Roman world. Yeah. And sewers and sanitation, underfloor heating. One of the reasons that the Romans did so well in England was because of underfloor heating. Ptolemy's famous for the Earth being the center of the solar system. And then you've got Islamic Arabic thinkers on maths and science that were particularly influential, particularly as they drew from Aristotle. Anyone know where in England this bathhouse is located that's 2,000 years old, that goes back to Roman times? Anyone recognise that? It's in the city of Bath in England. So the Romans, when they give you nice bathhouses like that, as they did in England, then it enabled the Romans to rule England in those times. They developed catapults. So there's a lot of emphasis on engineering, on dyeing and cloth making, and there was also an emphasis on surgery. And because they had gladiatorial fights in the ancient Roman world, there were opportunities for surgery. And it's interesting, in Cologne in Germany, when they dug down next to the huge Cologne Cathedral to build a museum, they ran into a Roman villa 2,000 years ago, and they discovered surgical instruments there. So they still have the Roman villa on display at the basement of the museum, and they have the surgical instruments, including the scalpels, etc., on display. So in ancient Roman times, you could, New Testament times, you could have surgery on all parts of the body. You could also have surgery of the diagnosis. You could have treatments. You could have surgery of the eyes, women as midwives, help babies be drawn. You could have surgery operations if you had a cataract. You could also have cesarean section if the baby wasn't being able to be born. So all of these approaches are also similar in some ways to today's approach. So science has huge origins from ancient times, is the point we want to make there. So the first session, we were talking about the value of the scientific method. In this next lesson, I want to talk about the limitations of the scientific method and teaching the scientific method. And I want to talk about teaching science that goes beyond the scientific method. Remember, we mentioned the sunset, and I think if you just use the scientific method to describe the sunset, I don't think you can fully describe it. Sometimes you need poetry, you need art, painting, all of these other ways of describing what's going on. To describe a human person, I think sometimes needs poetry, music, dance, drama, not just scientific observation and description. For instance, if you fall in love with someone and go over to them and say, there are hormones moving in my bloodstream that are drawing me closer to you, it doesn't go down as well as a romantic line as a bunch of flowers, chocolates, jewelry. So there's my piece of practical advice from today's lesson, the limitations of science in romance. Now, Peter Harrison also talked about the limitations of Aristotle in that he talked about going out and observing. But one of the big changes that occurred in the 17th century was the recognition that observing alone won't tell you what's going on. You need much more than observing. You need the knowledge of other people. And so you don't just carry out experiments, you also need to think about, what do we know already? Is it correct? How can we question it? How can we discuss it? You need some of the scientific method, but you also need a literature review of what is already known. Winchell and others have written about the limitations of the scientific method, and they say that the scientific method misrepresents the fundamental intellectual work done by many scientists and many scientists. It oversimplifies the process. So while it's useful to say, ask a question, carry out an experiment, we must remember that our worldview and our ideas are also going to be important. If you don't think more deeply about your worldview and your ideas, then you're not going to be successful. The scientific method's limited that way. Isaac Newton, he didn't just accept what was taught at the time or what he could see. He also thought about alternate ways of thinking, leading him to work with the idea of gravity, which he felt came to him through prayer and the Holy Spirit. Student questions can also be weak and limited if we just give them too simple an idea about the scientific method. For instance, students might ask, does Coca-Cola affect the plant's growth? And they could do experiments where they pour Coca-Cola on a plant. But scientists would never just do that. Scientists would ask, how does a plant grow? What do we know about nutrition? What's involved in the growth of a plant? So again, the literary review, asking questions about the nature of a plant's growth, would be the starting point of scientific study rather than simply carrying out scientific method and Coca-Cola on plants. Scientific method can also disconnect the inquiry from the accumulated scientific knowledge over years and the study of the concepts, the principles, the laws, and the models. Scientific method can promote experimentation without considering ethics, without considering everything else that's involved. So yes, it's useful, but it's not the only thing that it's useful. One of the most famous scientific method people would have to be B.F. Skinner. You've got Pavlov's dog and you've got Skinner. And Skinner said, it's a mistake to identify scientific practice with just statistics and the scientific method. He said these disciplines have their place, but it's more than this. He said some of the most important discoveries are made without a plan. The discovery of penicillin was when someone left the top of a petri dish and some penicillin spores blew in, landed on the petri dish and killed the other bacteria that were there. It was an accident. It wasn't scientific method. And many great scientific discoveries have come about that way. So it's more complex. And Thomas Kuhn, in his discussion of paradigm shifts, says that often it requires great change. Skinner quotes two rats, one saying to the other, boy, have I got this guy conditioned. Every time I press the bar down, he gives me a piece of food, implying that it's not the scientist who's conditioning the rats, it's the rats who are actually conditioning the scientist to give them food. So as Skinner says, really, science doesn't tell us enough about people and what they think and their presuppositions and preconceptions. So scientific knowledge has to be testable, has to raise questions, has to do things like the scientific method says, but it has to do much, much more. It has to engage with other people. It has to do research with others as well. And Peter Harrison says, It's only when the scientists of the 1700s returned to Plato's idea that the universe was governed by universal laws and that God gives these laws and that we have an ordered world that's worth studying, that led people to go forward instead of Aristotle's idea, just accept it the way it is, observe it, describe it, that's the way it is. Whereas it was scientists like Robert Boyle who says, we are looking for the perfections of God in the world. He says that we need to look for the laws of God. And he says that we can't gain understanding of our world unless we understand the laws that God has put in place to govern these laws. As Roger Bacon had used the word law to describe optics, and Kepler used the law idea to describe the way in which the planets move around the sun. Peter Harrison says that due to the undetermination of scientific theories, often people get the wrong idea about science. So science is much more than just describing what happens. Science is also an appreciation of the wonder of the natural world. As we said in the previous lesson, the motivation for scientific methods was also understanding that sin and corruption of the human nature leads people to look for experiments and verification that can't be corrupted by sin. Blaise Pascal said that it's an understanding of human sin and frailty of the fall that leads us to possess an image of the truth, but due to the fall, we're ignorant. Francis Bacon said that it's understanding this limitation due to sin that leads us to the need for scientific experimentation. Robert Hooke, who gives us the work on the microscope, says we have corruption within us. Given that this is the danger to human reason, we need to follow experiments that can prove what's going on. Also, the scientific method can be seen as individualistic, and we need to recognise that true science is corporate. We also need to recognise that instruments are often needed, like the telescope and the microscope, that helps us to overcome human limitations due to our eyesight not being able to see distant things and close things. So science is valuable, but we need a science that goes beyond just the scientific method, that appreciates everything that people can do. Science can include art, it can include models, it can include drawings. Science can include music, and even string theory has connection with, in physics, with the idea of music. So Christian scholars recognise that Christians aren't at war with science, and they have often been involved in the scientific enterprise, but no doubt there are secular scientists out there. So what is science? Science is about evidence-based, and science can involve using scientific methods, but much, much more that goes beyond the scientific method as well. So there are two views on the history of science. One is that they're at war with each other, and then the other that we have shown today is that they work together. One view, like in Carl Sagan's Cosmos, says that there was a dark ages from the time of the Christian church in 300 or 400 AD through to the time of the scientific revolution. And there are science books that you'll pick up and your students will pick up that say that. And really the idea of a dark ages is the construction of Protestants who were wanting to say the Catholic Church weren't interested in science, which is totally the opposite of reality. Oxford Uni, Cambridge, Padua, Paris, these universities were built in 1100 AD, hundreds and hundreds of years before the scientific revolution of the 1700s. So science has a long history through all the Middle Ages. It's not just something that appears in the 17th century, although there's certainly an increased emphasis on mathematical laws by Isaac Newton, Rene Descartes and others in the 1700s, and Robert Boyle. And there's a lot of scientific breakthroughs occur using these laws that discover chemistry and the chemicals and the periodic table at that time. And Francis Bacon is one of the leaders of these changes and developments. Now, you can get ideas about what a scientist is, and again, that can be rather wrong. Scientists are ordinary people. That is, every person interacts with scientists, and there's going to be different scientists doing things. However, someone has said we shouldn't actually allow science teachers to do playground duty because they can do experiments with the kids, which is not entirely helpful. So science does involve observation, measurement, experiments and laws, but scientists can also have a sense of awe and wonder and do art and music as well. Science does involve inductive logic, but they seek to prove that through experiments that are repeatable. It's important to recognise the difference between science and pseudoscience. There's a lot of people who claim science. Science follows the evidence, whereas pseudoscience just begins with what they want to know. Science is open to criticism and questioning as it's essential, whereas pseudoscience is hostile to criticism. Science uses precise terminology, pseudoscience uses jargons. Science claims to be conservative and careful, whereas pseudoscience often makes grand claims about UFOs, properly considers the evidence in science versus picks favourable evidence in pseudoscience, uses rigorous repeatable methods in experiments, uses flawed methods in pseudoscience, engages with the peers and communities and people who disagree, whereas pseudoscience is lone mavericks, follows careful, valid logic, whereas pseudoscience is inconsistent logic. And notice that religion can be the same. You can be part of a religious group that looks at the evidence, is open to criticism, it looks carefully at what's going on, dialogues with others, is careful about its thinking, or we can engage with religious groups that are just wanting to confirm what they believe, hostile to criticism, using jargon, making grandiose claims. And so science and pseudoscience are similar to Christianity and pseudo-Christianity, and religion and pseudo-religion. So pseudoscience, you can't prove it wrong, you use anecdotes, you cherry pick, you exaggerate, there's logical fallacies and no groups there. And astrology is an example of a pseudoscience that doesn't work. So science helps us to know God's world in God's ways. Isaac Newton wrote a paper, followed that. Einstein developed Newton's ideas further when he wrote his 3-page paper on the theory of relativity. So just 3 pages, and he won a Nobel Prize for it. Watson and Crick developed their model of the double helix. Again, there's certain matter of art and picture there, but there's also the development of the Human Genome Project, which is much, much longer and more developed. So beyond science, we have an understanding of human nature that goes much, much further. I want to look now at one type of science, which is psychology. So 2 very human sciences are sociology and psychology. But I want to look now at psychology as an example of going beyond the scientific method. So I want to briefly consider the changing history of psychology and some of the developments in psychology and the ways in which a study of the history of psychology tells us about science that goes beyond simply scientific method describing what is seen. So you'll find in many textbooks there is a description of science beginning, psychology beginning in 1879, when William Wundt starts to carry out psychological experiments in a psychological laboratory in Germany. So psychology, an understanding of the human person, began in 1879, 1880, when we first began to use scientific methods to understand how people think. And you read the same in Introduction to History of Psychology. William Wundt disagreed with Galileo and Kant, who said psychology can never be a science, whereas Herbert and others and Wundt had sought to prove that you could use mathematics to study the nature of the human person. And this description of psychology then builds on that. So humanistic psychology won't do as well, because that's just describing the human person. Another book, Introduction to Psychology, also says it's when we use maths and measurement to work things out, because we don't really know how bright students are in the first week of school unless we use an IQ test, do we? And we measure how bright they are, and then we know how bright they are. IQ tests using maths. Steven Pinker, professor of psychology at Harvard, said that history shows that the Enlightenment came, empirical studies, and then psychology, we argue, helps us to understand. Now, my concern is that these histories of psychology give us a view of the human person which just measures using numbers, just like IQ. You measure using numbers and we know the intelligence of a person. Surely that's way too limited to simply use maths in that way. Robinson, in his historiography in psychology, says that the history of psychology is much bigger and broader, and it even could go back to Aristotle. However, Plato too says that there's a bigger knowledge than Aristotle's view of simply observing people. Robinson sees the history of psychology as a series of engagements with issues relating to how we understand the human person. And the ancient Greeks were wrestling with these very questions. And Plato had said, surely a human person is like someone who rides a chariot and their lives are pulled in one way by a black horse, the thumos, controlling the attitudes, emotions, and feelings, and a white horse, the intellectual, reasoning, logical part that pulls our mind in another direction, and the mind then makes a decision. The seat of logic, the seat of reasoning is what controls where these go. And interestingly, this is quite similar to modern psychology and Freudian psychology, but it was written by Plato. Whereas Aristotle's views was, you see people, you describe them, and then you understand people. That oversimplifies it. But we need to realize that these ideas as how we understand the human person were contested thousands of years ago. It's not just a modern development. And Kurt Dassinger says, in relative short history, psychology has also had these sort of debates as to how we understand the human person. And historiography can help us understand. So there is this argument that psychology begins when we start to use science in 1879 and we measure how people respond. So you can measure how quickly people respond to sound, how quickly people respond to light, and then you know everything about a human person. You can observe them and measure them. And these histories of psychology, however, overlook the complexity of understanding the nature of the human person. These lead to behaviorism, where Pavlov, looking at dogs, ring a bell and they salivate, Watson, looking at behaviorism, and also Skinner, looking at behaviorism. So Pavlov, you ring a bell, dogs can salivate, surely we can understand our students. You know, you reward them with sugar sweets, they'll do well. You don't reward them, they won't do so well. There's a weakness in that. Watson too, founder of behavioralism, he wanted to observe what was going on, and that's valuable in your classroom, to observe how people are going to write reports. But there's things going on in their mind that you don't fully understand, going on at home that you don't fully understand. There's more going on than you can observe. B.F. Skinner, as we quoted before, said that we need to study reinforcement and punishment, but that's not the only thing that goes on. So behaviorism is an attempt to describe people using the scientific method. Tickner went further. He devised a structuralism that looks at sense and perception, but he also wanted to include introspection, but some psychologists said, no, you can't look at what's going on inside the human mind. William James, the first American psychologist, said you can't just measure things. Human people, and he wrote the book Varieties of Religious Experience, in which he said you've got to consider conversion and experience and religious beliefs, said the founder of psychology at Harvard Uni in the 1870s. You've got to consider the function of different beliefs. So functionalism, according to William James, emphasizes the function of how people think and adapt to their environment. And Sigmund Freud said, a lot of what you can see going on isn't what people are really thinking. It's in their subconscious and they don't even know what's going on, and you only find it through dreams. So you can't just observe what's going on, said Freud. You got to look at their unconscious, subconscious, that they're not even aware of. And we get Freudian slip and anal retentive and unconscious thoughts and psychodynamic theory. And his student, Carl Jung, goes further. And Carl Jung has above his entrance to his house there, acknowledge him or not, God will be present, pointing out that God is present in this whole process. So psychology develops in the 1870s, 1880s, but 60, 80 years before that, Frederick Sibbern, teaching psychology and philosophy in Denmark, had a strong connection between psychology and the arts and poetry. And Sibbern expressed the view that the ideal psychologist should also be a poet and work with literature. And one of his students, Soren Kierkegaard, went as far as to say in his concluding unscientific postscript that he doubted that science would explain everything. And he said, truth is subjective, not objective. And he argued that you can't just ask everyone at university to be objective and describe things remotely at a distance. You've got to allow people to be subjective and express themselves. So he argues for the importance of subjectivity, and I found that quite influential when I read that. Made me really think. So Kant and Kierkegaard also warned against narrowly defining people and how we understand people using empirical research, as Willem Wundt had done in Leipzig in Germany, is going to reduce people to objects who are moved like pawns on a chessboard. And Soren Kierkegaard said that we need to understand that there are kinds of despair that people have because they're unaware, they're not accepting what's true, they're unaware of themselves and who they could be. And so we need to recognize subjectivity. We need to recognize eternity. We need to recognize people are aware that there's an eternal realm out there. And people are also aware of sin and their failings. We need to acknowledge that in our psychology, said Soren Kierkegaard. And he said in Sickness Unto Death that people have a sickness of sin that damages their life, and that they need to have this transformation and change. And every one of us is like a physician next to the sickbed of each other, where we're meant to be helping each other. So really, as a number of these thinkers in psychology have said, is that religion plays a part in psychology as well. This has led some psychologists like Victor Frankl, everything can be taken from a man but freedom, their freedom to choose, determine their humanistic psychologists like Fromm and Carl Rogers and Rollo May are saying that we need to understand how people really are. And so it's these other ways of thinking. Martin Buber said, the way we understand ourselves is not what we think. We need to listen to others and value others, and we need to listen to God and value God, in his famous writing on I Thou. And Paul Tillich said, we aren't really alive as humans until we have the vitality and courage to be who we can be. And so humanistic psychology seeks to recognize the conscious experience of each person as they freely decide, rather than be objectively description. Back to the description of an IQ in an IQ test, intelligence quotient. We don't just put a label on people, we enable and encourage people to become the best that they can. That's truly helping people and studying intelligence. And then in recent times, we've had neuroscience and behavioral genetics and cognitive science that have helped us to go further. So there's some thoughts on fresh ways we can look at science. So can I get some thoughts then on from Matilda and then Josiah and Ruben and Stephanie on what stood out to you on going beyond the scientific method in this last presentation over the last half hour or so. So going beyond scientific method, observation.
Hey,
yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Can you hear me, Sam? Wait.
Yes.
Cool. Awesome. Sorry, we've got a few people in a room, so it's a bit hard to figure out where the volume and stuff's going. I really enjoyed how you discussed the different educational theories like behaviorism and like whatever that is, socio-cultural and all that, because I have actually been doing a little bit of research into those myself, and I think some of the past theories that have been used looked like they were suiting for the time that they were in, but then as our world goes, like, progresses and changes and, you know, all that, it definitely, they become less relevant, like especially behaviorist. I feel like back then you could reward the child and then they would do it, and then you would punish them and then they wouldn't do that anymore. But then as soon as you take the reward away, the child would pretty much just not want to interact at all, and so it would shut them down. And when they started realizing that was happening, that's when, you know, they needed to reassess, and then they went into sociocultural theory, which was a lot later, but, you know, but yeah, I don't know, I just thought that was really cool that you talked about that. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, so good. And you really point out well there the way science is on a journey of discovery. And as Christians, we would say it's a journey of discovery about God's world. And how do we know about God's world? There are various ways, through observing, measuring, and you've got to use that in your classroom. You've got to keep records. You've got to use all the testing that you can, but you've got to keep it under control. And so certainly testing can be helpful, but that's not the only thing that's going on. There's a lot of invisible things, unseen things that are going on there as well. Josiah, thoughts? Going beyond scientific method and beyond observation and objectification.
Yeah, I find psychology a pretty interesting case study. I think it's very relevant to the use of the scientific method and how it definitely highlights the ways in which it fails to fulfill, I don't know, all areas of knowledge and all areas of research, because it doesn't allow any room for subjectivity. While I do not entirely agree with the statement that truth is subjective, I think that our world is largely defined by our perception of it. So I think that was an interesting insight that came through the history of psychology.
Yeah, like that inside our world is defined by our perception of the world. And that too is defined by language. When we come back in 3 weeks' time, we'll look at language, but it's also defined by our culture, also by our subcultures. So if you're a member of a particular subcultural group, you'll accept vaccination or you'll doubt vaccination. So different subcultures can shape how we perceive our world. So in one sense, truth is subjective, but we want to also we see the value of the objective. We just realise that it's not as easy to find the objective as we sometimes think. It's in God. Yeah, Ruben, your thoughts?
I was interested just before you went into psychology, more so how you talked about with the ancient Greeks and how they were using metaphors to explain the sciences. So especially the one with the chariot, where they had the black horse and the white horse, which you had the inner reasoning, which was positive, and then like pulling away. I thought that was cool. That was interesting to see that there. Almost without realizing it, they'd started to apply a method to explain things going on around them, but they didn't have a structure like we do now to explain it. But it shows that, as Joe was just saying, that we can be limited by taking away from the subjective, because obviously we're all going to have a small bit of bias. So they were, in their subjective, they were saying that everything came from that sort of spiritual perspective, I guess.
Yeah, so good. And then on to Stephanie, your thoughts.
Yeah, I don't have anything particularly insightful to say, but I did enjoy looking at the science versus pseudoscience. So I thought that was cool to make the distinction between those. And then, yeah, again, with the truth is subjective point, I just thought that was an interesting thing to think about more. Yeah, I just don't have a lot to say, sorry.
Sounds good. So in drawing it all together, we can say that the wonder of the world around us has led people to use scientific methods to describe what is happening. And the word science simply means knowledge of the natural world methods, which can include observing. Notice the importance of Socratic questioning, asking questions, but going beyond that, using experiments to overcome the limitations of sin in order to understand the sense of order that's in the world around us. And so when we look at the human person, if we're going to fully understand the nature of the human person, then we need skills to examine each of these parts to describe it. But notice how much is involved. You know, if you're going to become a doctor of the urinary system, that's probably the only thing you study, because it's going to take so much of your time to become an expert on that part of the body. Or a doctor of the heart and circulatory system, that'll probably be the only thing you study, because there's so much involved. And you need to look at all of the knowledge that's been accumulated. And then every time a person goes into a hospital, they keep records of how they treat the person, and that adds to the knowledge all the time. So knowledge is very much accumulating. There's a huge body of knowledge. Used to be all kept in encyclopedias and libraries, but it's much, much larger now. And many people see a sense of order in the universe that leads them to a sense that we have a responsibility to describe this order. In Timaeus, Plato described the order and beauty, and this motivated him. Pythagoras described it, that motivated him as well. And then in more recent times, Kepler, Newton, and others. And so whether we look at a cell or whether we look at the human body, there's a sense of order that can lead us to wonder, that we can write poetry about, art about. But if we're really going to know it in great detail, then science may be needed. The Earth is unique. Just the right distance, just the right place, the Goldilocks effect and range leads to life. We need to take care of it. The elements were gradually discovered. Certainly 2,000 years ago, they had iron and bronze and they were able to melt them, but it's only been in the last 300, 400 years or so that we've found all the elements that we've been able to put together, but we still don't know fully about dark matter. So finding a sense of order in the world has motivated people. Some claim that the universe is meaningless, but the way we look at the world is a bit like the way we look at different paradigms. According to Thomas Kuhn, paradigms are the ways in which we choose to look. And so in this example, you can either see a tree or you can see a face, but it's been described to show both and set up to show both. You can see a young person or an older person. They're set up to show. So it's the paradigms that we bring, partly what we're looking for, and we're all looking for a sense of meaning. So it's this study of meaning in the world that leads us to a sense of understanding the order that's in the world. And we've now understand, I think people used to look up to the stars to know what the seasons were. Now we're encouraged to look up and realize that it's part of a broader world. And leaders in this change were people like Copernicus, who was a Christian minister who saw the beauty in the rotation of the world, and he applied mathematics to that. Galileo too writes about how he's seeking to glorify God because God writes the universe using the laws of mathematics, and then he was able to get a telescope, and using a telescope he was able to see what was there. Kepler too applied the laws of mathematics and his faith in God, and he said the chief aim of all investigation should be to discover the rational order and harmony which has been placed there by God and revealed to us in language, including the language of mathematics. Newton too discovered laws of gravity, and he said his thumb alone convinces him that God is there. In want of other proofs, the thumb alone would convince me of the existence of God. Without the thumb, the hand would be defective and incomplete. So for Newton, the idea that God designed the universe was evidence that the universe is fine-tuned, and it's our duty in science to understand that tuning that's there. In the last 10 minutes or so, let's go back to the